This is Greg Brooks, and you're live watching the Break It Down show.
We are live indeed. Yeah. So I get to talk to amazing people who do incredible things in so many different disciplines. And one of the things that fascinates me, Greg, is just systems and blending systems together and intentions and outcomes. And it's just so hard to get everything to work well together. I live in California, and let's set politics aside. It is really hard to manage a state the size and the geographically diverse. It's really hard. If you made perfect decisions over the course of 25 years, which obviously no one does, and if you had impeccable timing, you couldn't handle all of the problems that this state would throw at you.
Right. And then, people and their damn opinions, right? If you were an autocratic ruler, it would be much easier. But
right.
People tend to have their own ideas.
So when you think about, so for everybody, one of the things that Greg does is he tries to help us think through planning cities. So I recently went to Tahiti, and I'm fascinated how a place like Tahiti survives, and so it seems to Pete that when you have a place like Tahiti, you have the folks that are status quo, like, hey, what we have right now is pretty good. It works for us. It's not the worst, not the best. We're going to keep with that. And this principle kind of applies to Native Americans and, gosh, our until recently current situation in Israel, with Palestine until last weekend. But you have the status quo folks. You have the folks who are like, F everybody. We don't need anybody. We're moving on in our own direction. And then you have the folks that are like, hey, let's just be French. Let's just be French. Let's just go all in, and why don't you make us a province of France, right? And so you're always trying to balance these things. And it's just hard to make a society work. When you go to Tahiti, apparently they don't like having veterinarians. They don't like to care for their dogs. They don't spay and neuter. They get hit by cars. They run loose in the street. They're always pregnant. They're not necessarily feral, but they're not controlled pets either. And so you just have all these things where you're like, this is chaos. You have to have oil. They can't have a deep port, and so everything's got to be unported somewhere else. And then all these things, right, which causes more carbon. But all these things make it complex on how to deal with things in paradise. Like, how do you get asphalt and bitumen 2,400 miles from New Zealand? And how do they get it? Because they're not near anything.
Right. And a lot of the times the answer is you don't, right? Because you just make do with what you've got.
Right.
You went really big picture on me, but the dynamic is the same everywhere, right? It's easy to look at Tahiti and say, okay, Tahiti's got these dynamics. There are people who essentially want to encase the current status quo under a glass dome. There are people who think that they can turn it into a utopia of some sort, and there are a lot of people just struggling to get by with their lives for the most part, right? And they're not deeply engaged. Well, welcome to the dynamic of nearly every American city, right? That's exactly what exists, right? People, you have a tension, and it's, to your earlier point, it's not drawn along traditional political lines. I got into local government work because while I am on the right, I also recognize that the right in America has sort of systematically abandoned and avoided cities for more than half a century now, right? It went from this sort of Jeffersonian model of, we can go carve the life out that we want for ourselves in the suburbs, right? To eventually, no, let them have their problems, isolate them there, and we'll actively fight them. But now, and unfortunately now you've got me on a bit of a roll about this topic, but there is no libertarian shack in the woods that's far enough away for any of us to avoid the ripple effects if America's cities fail. And they are in danger broadly of failing because people have figured out how to milk the system, and the left is not alone in being very good at that, but in cities they are extremely good at that. And the economic impact of our cities is felt in every nook and cranny of rural America, right? If they fail, we all have a problem. So one of the reasons Better Cities was founded was to try and bring some practical solutions to people. We can't show up like wild-eyed conservatives, because guess what? Most city halls are not bright red. They're blue or they're purple. And anyway, back to your point about Tahiti, because I was coming back to that, it was the same dynamic of utopians who want to change everything with no regard to rights or political process, or if I'm going to be fair, little regard. People who want to dip their entire community in amber, and you can change whatever you want about the community after I'm dead, right?
Yeah.
And then a lot of people who simply are not that engaged, but they would like their roads not to have potholes. They would like their police force to be efficient and effective while protecting individual rights. They would like their taxes to be visibly paying for goods and services that they need, right? Those three groups squabbling with each other is kind of where we're at on the ground. And in city, we focus on America's largest cities, which we broadly talk about being, everybody of 100,000 or above. And, it's a third of the country. It's about 236 cities. And that doesn't mean we don't talk to smaller cities, but if you call me and you're in a city of 100,000 or more people, we're going to sit up and take notice and try and help a little bit actively, just because, your bang for the buck goes further.
One of the things that's interesting to me, so my dad ran a town called Capitola. He was on the board for a long time. And my dad is, he's a Vietnam era left guy, right? And so because you have to peg the era of when you were a Democrat, right? And so his solutions are often of that era. Folks from that era, he's one of them, loves a train. They love a train. We got to have a train, and trains solve problems. I sat up because I want to do my part, and look, I'm more in the middle. You ask me on a topic, it could be left, it could be right. I might change my mind. So I don't know, but anyhow, I sat on a subcommittee at the county level for pedestrian affairs, and we had a little bit of influence with money, and we tended to vote en bloc because we're like, this is how we're all here, we're all volunteers, and we're going to go in this direction. And we had to look at the county as a whole, and it was interesting to see what the projects were and what was interesting. And the influence of things like consultants. Hey, we know how to get this project through the state.
That's right.
And then you're like, wait, this LA County? And you have to have a competitive bid. That's, and so there's all of these sub things that cost money. And now all of a sudden it's like this competition as opposed to the project, and do we need it? And so like one of the things we have out here in California are we're painting all this green paint so that people can ride their bikes. But I pay attention to these things. I look at the buses when they go by. I look at the green painted lanes. I look at the multimodal transportation hubs, and I look at the bike racks. Are people using these things? No, they are not. So we make these decisions with the belief that people are going to use these systems, and when they don't, where's the accountability? Hey, we made a bad decision.
Okay, so you've touched on, what do we have, 6 or 8 hours? Because we're going to need a bit of time here.
I know, right?
But you've touched upon two of the key dynamics that we.
Can I say one thing real quick before you go into? Because so I would bring these points up, and I'm like, you're showing me a heat map with two people got smushed by a car across a high-speed road that you want to cross, and you're saying this is like a terror zone in 4 years. That's not what you use a heat map for, right? And so they're like, yeah, but so they would use stats incorrectly, and also they would say one of my most hated phrases: "Build it and they will come." That's bullshit.
It is bullshit.
No, you have to earn that change. Okay, now I'm going to shut up and get out of your way.
No, you don't need to shut up. You're on the right track. So two things. One, cities. If you take the concept of a city, as a thousands of years old concept for people organically coming together to create value and to create protection for themselves. Cities don't operate on that principle anymore. Organized, incorporated cities in America are vertically integrated enterprises that are really good at identifying and capturing funding sources. That's the game these days. You mentioned consultants, and you mentioned this dynamic of consultants saying, "Oh, well, we can help you identify funding for X, Y, and Z." That's the game, right? Because there's not enough local revenue to do a lot of big things that they want. And, this is true in the private sector as well as the public sector. Any department of more than 2 people will take on as part of its mission, how do we sustain and grow ourselves, right? And in local government, what that looks like is, okay, how do we find funds to grow programs that and it's not this evil, nefarious thing. It's just basic organizational behavior.
Right.
The other thing you mentioned that you moved over to, talking about bike lanes and whatnot, one of the big problems we have, and it's a problem, I'm a former journalist, and I think this problem exists in journalism too. Planning, both as a function and as a career path by the people in local government who need to do planning, that is not an evil thing by itself, right? Cities need to know, what does the water picture look like for the next 2 decades? What do our infrastructure needs look like? The problem is when people take those jobs with a sense of personal mission. I believe that the path forward is to create you throw whatever words you want at it, right? Sustainable, walkable, 15-minute green, and people love to demonize those terms. None of those terms are necessarily bad. None of those concepts are necessarily bad, except when a small number of people empowered by their jobs get into a room and decide to drag the community in that direction rather than serving the needs and the priorities of the community. It is a huge problem in cities all over the country, and it cuts across ideological lines, right? You can have you can have Republican-run cities that chase things that are not necessarily what the population wants, and you can have the same with the bluest progressive cities.
One of the things that so I would talk to our mayor, and she would kind of give me her walking orders, and I'm like, well, I'm not really going to do what you say because I'm looking at the county. I understand that I'm representing the city, but these growing emerging cities don't have as much as we have, and so I'm trying to look and make a decision, the right decision. And she would say things to me that were just untrue. So she was educated in all of this development stuff, and she would say, the reason why people walk is this. And I'm like, well, I've been in town, and our town's on a hill. It's in California. It's on the edge of the water. And so growing up there, I know a couple things. One, people will walk downhill, but they won't walk up.
Right.
They'll walk about a mile. This is all known, but our town is gorgeous. So people walk for pleasure and they walk for fellowship. But they don't want to walk along a high speed thing. And she wanted to finally finish the sidewalk over this. The street's called Military, and you can guess why. It was like the military path to get into the old arsenal, and it's wide, and it's a boulevard. Nobody walks on that because it's wide, it's loud, it's uphill both ways, and so
all of the pleasure of walking is gone. Right,
it's gone. And so when people walk for fitness, they go out to the state park. They don't use this area, and so she wanted to spend money on that, and she wanted me to help her find it at the county. And I'm like, they got kids trying to cross streets in other towns. We're going to spend our money there because these towns have new schools. This is an old road from 100 years ago. We're not spending money there. And so she had no idea why people walked in her own town because she was stuck in this dynamic that, and this is the mayor, right? So she had no idea why people walked in that town and where she might improve it. And where people wanted improvements for walking were the old ancient sidewalks that were all busted up. And then she'd go, that's not my problem. Like, well,
no, it is literally the definition of your job to focus on that.
Yeah. I know. You're
in a governance role to make, Look, we could sit around and have the libertarian angels on the head of a pin debate
Right.
about what the role of government is, but
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and go to the mat and say that if you are elected in local government, one of your jobs is to ensure that the infrastructure is there for your city to continue as a going concern. And that's one of the things that most local governments are shirking right now. There's not a mid-sized or large city in America that adequately covers its ongoing operations and maintenance costs for its infrastructure. It is all kick the can down the road.
Boy, it is tough. And again, I'm using my little old hometown, Benicia, as an example.
Yeah,
it's on a hill,
mm-hmm.
and in it is a refinery that a lot of the town hates because they don't like refineries, and probably politically. And here's the thing: that
who needs gas? Who needs plastics?
Yeah, well, that refinery makes the vast majority of the asphalt for all of Northern California.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah. And so instead of having even just like a uncomfortable relationship, but when you go, hey, listen, we know you're like the number one bill payer in town too, by the way. Mm-hmm. Instead of going there and say, how do we work something out? We have these streets that are in terrible shape and always will be. They're always going to slide off this hill. There's grass growing through the asphalt in this town, right? And they cannot figure out how to become, and I think the refinery, look, they have their own evil doings, right? But they're also willing to partner if they'll work together. But they would rather that refinery leave and cripple the town financially than to find a way to work together, right? And so this is part of this broken ideological thing. And I want to add another part into this. This has nothing to do with politics, but we don't know how to say when enough is enough for a town and say this town should be about 40,000 people with this kind of a tax engine in it. And we can bring water in from this source. And then to expand that, well, we'd have to expand the whole entire system, right? So like I was using my dad earlier, Capitola and Santa Cruz basically are the same town.
Yeah.
We don't have enough room. There are earthquakes there. It's just not a place. It is so old and tightly packed. Code doesn't make sense there. There are easements where the houses overlap, right? One of my dad's neighbors, their house, the asphalt, it touches. Their house is the curb. Wow. So it's like, it's a complex place that you're trying to govern, and UC Santa Cruz just welcomes all the students it can get. It expands all the time, and there's just nowhere for all these people to go, and they cannot get enough fresh water, and there's no way they're going to get access to the land to bring more fresh water in, right? And that's just water. And so you look at these complex problems where in California, our desire to conserve and preserve nature makes the left very conservative in that they don't want to change things, and they'll go into the lawfare mode. And so you have whole portions of the system that are crippled. And I'm not assigning any blame or anything, but
and you've got tools like CEQA out there that just make it very easy to go into that mode and stop anything.
And so the system is crippled. And how do you manage something like that? Because we need water. Let's do desal. Nope, can't do that. Let's appropriate funds to raise all the dams. Nope, can't do that. And so you can't fix a problem, but you're going to continue to add people to exacerbate the problem.
I suppose I have a different take on that. In that, look, the conceit is thinking that it's a problem that we can fix in leadership, right? That market dynamics are going to solve this problem. If your community does not build anything, then demand necessarily has to slack off. People will simply go elsewhere. As big as the largest, and Santa Cruz is a great example. Santa Cruz is a sizable city with some giant economic engines in it, in the form of the university. But there comes a point at which you cannot bring more people in, right? If you bring a student in and it costs $60,000 a year to house a student in that community for a year versus whatever the current number is, I suspect it's less than 60. Then, okay, somebody's got to bear that cost, or they have to put a cap on it. I'm not really worried about getting there through an active policy solution. Because what happens
Okay.
is when you give people the power to make that decision, it's very, very easy for people to say, okay, rather than reducing barriers that are going to make building the housing you need, and maybe for the purposes of this discussion, we can agree that that market does not have the housing it needs to meet the demand, right?
Right. Yeah, for sure.
So you can do one of two things, right? You can either do nothing, market, or one of three things. You do nothing and market dynamics force people to make other decisions. You can force the local private economy to accommodate it by things like inclusionary zoning, where the developer wants to build 80 units and you say, you know what, Mr. Developer, we're going to let you build 60 units, but only if you build 20 units over here that are priced at the rates that somebody of moderate income can afford, right? And so you're tinkering with the market, and that's very, very compelling for a local elected official, but there's plenty of academically sound research that says it does not lead to the outcomes you want. The thing that nobody does, that I'm out there with my team going, hey, try this, is actually address the things that make your housing so impossibly expensive, right? And that comes down to the cost of the dirt and the cost of the regulatory overhead. The regulatory overhead on new multifamily construction, nationwide average, is about 40%. 40% of the cost of building that apartment building is involved in permitting it, getting it through the planning process. There are things in there you don't want to tinker with. You don't want to take away OSHA compliance. Nobody's arguing for that, right? But the two biggest components of that 40% are planning, permitting, and zoning processes to get to project approval, which is this huge area where the answer is not yes or no, it's will see. And will see is extraordinarily expensive for developers. And the other is new regulations added in the last 10 years, things like green space requirements and stuff like that. So that's 40% of multifamily. It's about 25% of single family home development. Local government has all the tools they need right now to attack that and make it easier to build lower cost housing. Now that, to your point as a resident, or your father's point, that may not be what you want in your community, right? And I get that, but that's a political issue. And I think it's fair to say that moving in a community does not give you the rights to determine what everybody else in the community gets to do with their property. The closest you're going to come to that is private covenants in an HOA or something. And that's the reason some people love HOAs, right? But you know, in the town where I live in, Carson City, Nevada, it is overwhelmingly single family homes, and we have a need for more housing. More people want to move here than can move here right now. When a developer shows up with an apartment building, you have people who live 6-7 miles away from the proposed complex, talking about how that will impact the character of our community, and we can't have that here. I'm sorry, you know, in my world, you don't get to do that, at least not credibly, right?
That's a NIMT, not in their backyard.
Right. Well, yeah. Not in my general region.
Right.
Is where it's at.
Yeah.
And you know, we don't. The folks who advocate for more abundant housing, they don't do themselves any favors. I mean, the what I call left YIMBY has never met a centralized planning solution they didn't love. Right. So yes, we need more housing, but while we're at it, why don't we mandate, you know, Soviet-style brutalist apartment building?
They just never learned a lesson
for $200 a month, right?
Yeah.
You know, there's Nolan Gray, who runs research for California YIMBY, and he has this great phrase that he calls them the revolution first YIMBYs. It's like, whatever your solution is, the answer is yes, but first revolution. And that's just not a way you get things done, right?
Right.
Anyway,
Yeah.
I led you down the path of talking about local housing. I'm sure you wanted to
Yeah.
talk about other things.
No, but it is important because we do think that housing, we do tend to think, at least here in California, that more housing is the answer. And then that leads to looking around and you go, like here where I am in Orange County, we've built a lot of housing. We've got a lot of this military land that is now finally, we've unlocked it and we're going to build it.
I lived in Orange County when most of it was built, brother. I know what you're talking about.
We're not adding new airports because heaven forbid we do that.
Right.
There is no room to easily add more. You can stack freeways, right?
Mhm.
But I don't know where you're going to put all these people. There are, and this is people, you know this, but there are equidistant from my house 5 Home Depots, and they are all busy at all times. And so I don't know where you're going to put all these people. I mean, it's just,
well, you're going to put them in. Assuming you build something, right? If
Right.
that's what we're doing, right? Assuming
Yeah.
you build something, it's not going to look like what's been built in Orange County for the last 40 years, right? What's built in the last 40 years in Orange County, in a large part, was the vision of the Irvine Company.
Right.
And it looks a lot like stucco houses on quarter, third, and rarely half-acre lots.
Right.
And it looks a lot like master planning. The thing is, those of us who own those types of properties, and I've got an acre on a hillside in Carson City. I am that suburban homeowner, right?
Right.
But
yeah,
it's incumbent on us not to think that is the only way. Young families, they don't want this. They can't afford it. But even if they could afford it, they don't necessarily want it. But the types of housing that, my metric for this, and I'm working on a project statewide in Utah where this is sort of our North Star, is, okay, what can a teacher who's been teaching for less than 5 years, or a cop who's been in the job less than 5 years, or a young family with a baby that's thinking maybe they want one parent to stay home, what can they afford in terms of housing? And how do we back into that from a regulatory standpoint? And what it looks like are small lot homes. It looks like cottage court homes. It looks like condos. And, it doesn't have to look like people have a reflexive against apartment buildings. It doesn't have to look like apartment buildings. But instead of putting one home on half an acre, there are topologies that will let you put 4 or 5 or even 6 little cottage court homes that are all detached, all single family on that lot. And guess what? People can afford to buy them without earning $100,000 a year.
Yeah. When I was saying where are you going to put them, I mean, once they leave that cottage, right? Because Orange County is already so crowded. I mean, there's residents. There are 3.5 million people here. Now you bring in all the tourists and everything else. If you added another 500,000 people here that were residents, it is just everything is crowded. Like if you want to see a new movie, you have to wait 3 or 4 weeks before you can reliably get the seat. Like it's just a very crowded place in parts of Orange County. Where I am, it's just I don't know, like, intersections on the freeway are dangerous because there's just so many cars, and it gets to be hard to manage.
Orange County is this great crucible of the progression of that, right? You went from having crowded freeways that had a really extensive HOV network to having HOV connectors to now being congestion priced and tolled networks. And, this is where, in most markets, throwing tons and tons of money at transit does not make sense because you don't have the density, right? And the conundrum is if you wait until you have the density, you can't afford the right of way, right? But, to your question of, okay, how are all these people going to get around, right?
Yeah.
Transit may become more viable in Orange County. And I suppose that's a maybe answer. And the real answer is, if nobody wants to spend money on transit and nobody wants to spend money on double decking the freeways or other things, well, guess what? You live in a place that's currently crowded. It's going to get more crowded. And people here, and here's where the miracle of free will comes in, right?
Yeah.
People making their own individual choices will make fewer discretionary trips. Everybody's got to get to work from, at whatever time they go to work. So a million years ago, if you live in Orange County, and I apologize for the viewers watching because this has become the Orange County hour, but
Yeah.
the nation's first private and fully automated toll road was the 91 Express lanes out there. And I was involved with that project when it was being built.
Yeah.
And, we almost immediately got tagged with the Lexus lanes, right? Okay. People who can afford will avoid the traffic. But what we found early on, and this has stuck with me now for almost 30 years, people put different values on their time at different times, right?
Yeah.
The people who loved those toll lanes, small solo business people running handyman businesses, little one-man, two-man plumbing operations, because those lanes meant they could get 2 or 3 more jobs a day in.
That's right.
For the guy who's coming home from work and his kid's got a little league game, right? His time's worth more to get in that lane and do that. Maybe his wife's making tuna casserole and he hates tuna casserole. So it's like, okay, I'm going to sit in the freeway traffic and kind of miss out on dinner. But I'm not saying that tolled lanes solve all of your concerns. What I'm saying is that as you get growth, the answer is very seldom, what will government do to accommodate all of this growth? No, the answer is millions of people making individual decisions for their own betterment.
Yeah. And it's an interesting problem too. Like when you drive across, let's say I'm doing a show remotely at someone's house in the valley, right? Very common for me to do that. I'll go to some actor's house. If I leave at a certain time, forget it. Like there are too many vehicles entering and exiting the travel path all the way down. And so that it's just a constant state of gridlock, and there's just no unlocking that because there's just so many people in motion that have to use. It's not like regular traffic because there's just so many variables along the way, and then you mix in just the insane variables that get bigger. I love to keep track of all of the things that happen in Southern California. We've had, since I've lived down here about 7 years now, we've had 2 different times when full-size fire trucks have fallen off of, or the road has collapsed under them during a rain or a landslide, and a giant fire truck is dumped down into a canyon. A lady was in a police chase and she had a whole mess of dogs in her car, and so she stopped, and the dogs got out, and it's like, all like this insane things. Once a year at least, a plane lands on a freeway,
right?
And it's just all of these things. When you think about response to all of this chaos, and I love to talk about how LA County has a 10,000-foot peak and the ocean, and everything in between, South Central and Malibu. It's just wildly different places, and trying to manage that, provision it as a government, as a city, as a county. It is fantastically complex and different and difficult, right? And so you're trying to be open on this. Even if Gavin Newsom was omniscient, you would still be untenable. Like you just cannot manage a place that's that complex. But are there places that are reliably manageable? Is it related to politics? I mean, can you find a path where you can take a complex city and manage it well indefinitely?
Well, I think you have to define what managing it well means. I mean, if you get 100 people in the room, a non-trivial number of them are going to say managing it well looks an awful lot like autocratic rule, right? And that's not something I'm out there pursuing. Sure. To me, managing a city well is, I'm going to back up on you before I make that sound point.
Please.
Because there's something we've left out of the conversation. I don't think most people understand. Most folks would read our federal Constitution and say, okay, the role of the government is constrained by what's in the Constitution.
Right.
And the government's primary role is to protect the rights and property of citizens. Many state constitutions mirror that. Cities are creations of the state. And if the state does not give them an explicit role, it's kind of the Wild West in terms of what a city's real responsibilities are.
This is great.
And so I wake up every morning thinking, wouldn't it be cool if there were a way to explicitly bind what a city could and couldn't do to protecting the rights, at least nominally protecting the rights and property of citizens, right? Mirror that federal role. That would stop a lot of nonsense. And, we're working on some ideas in that direction, but it's important as a concept to understand that when you talk about managing a city well, unless the city has a charter, and there are not a whole lot of big charter cities in the U.S., which if for those listening, a city charter in states that have city charters is the equivalent of city constitution. But for cities that don't have charters, the job is whatever they decide the job is, subject to the limits of state law. And so that's how you get cities deciding, okay, we're going to make climate a priority. That's how you get cities deciding. And I apologize, all of these are left-leaning examples, and I don't mean to pick on the left, but we are going to become a sanctuary city. We are going to ban this, that, or the other. We're going to have gun restrictions that are stronger than what the state has mandated, and we're happy to go to court and fight that. There are no walls in the room telling them they can't do that.
Right.
So they head off and do that. So a well-managed city starts with figuring out what the job of the city is. I'm happy to sit here and say, well, your job is to protect the rights and property of citizens and then to make everything work. But that's just my opinion. If a city wakes up and says, no, our job is to be the most climate friendly, carbon neutral city in America, and that's what the citizens of that city want, go do that thing, right? Let that be your priority. But what it cannot be is 5 city council members or 15 people in a staff meeting deciding they're going to drag the community. Right.
It's
Pete, you're frozen on me. All right, Pete, I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm going to jump out and jump back on and see if that helps.
all right. I got kicked out of my own. There we go. Okay, now we're good.
I'm back.
I got kicked out of my own show because I need the government to take Wi-Fi from me.
It's because we're talking about, reigning in cities. They know. They know we're on a list.
All right. So I want to see which network I'm on. Okay. Can I get onto the other network? Yeah. I don't know. Maybe it's not worth it. Let's see if we can do it on this one. Okay. I wanted to change gears because I'm fascinated on your thoughts on this. So I grew up in the Bay. We talked about that earlier. And if I remember, because I grew up being a fan of the A's and loving baseball and everything, and Oakland has just had it. They've had it handed to them left and right over these last 30 years. And the A's have been along on this ride, this odyssey of trying to figure out where they were going to live and saying, hey, this market's not good for us. And California, with the way they do things, this is not political, but there are a lot of competing groups, and they use things like lawfare, like we talked about earlier, to make things hard. It's like, oh, hold on. We're a union and you want to do this, and so we're going to take you to court. And it's like, oh, damn it. And it's 6 months, 2 years, whatever it is, right, held up on this thing. And so and it's constant. And so as a business owner, the A's are like, you know what? So 4 different owners are like, I've had it. selling. Can't do it anymore, right? And so at some point, the current owner, Fisher, is and he's fantastically wealthy. His family have made a lot of money, but he's like, I'm done. And Major League Baseball's like, well, you're going to have to go through this crucible and this miserable journey to prove to us that Oakland's not a viable market. And he's like, all right, we're going to do it. And so he went through this whole process and has destroyed his relationship with the fans in the city. And the city has obliged by being equally a terrible partner for business. And so they've lost the Warriors, they've lost the Raiders, and now they're going to lose the A's. The place where they were going to move, one of the places is called Howard Terminal. It's a ship terminal where they pull. Well, they used to pull containers off. It's closed, and I would imagine it's considered a hazmat site for any kind of California kind of development. So nothing's going to be there anytime soon. You can't put a ballpark there. It was part of the reason why they couldn't do that. It was hyper expensive to recondition this place. There was a little fun center where you could race little race cars. It was called Malibu Grand Prix. You could drive around. That thing closed down 20 years ago. It's connected to the parking lot where the Coliseum is. That's gone. And man, Oakland just loses businesses left and right. And so the A's, like the Raiders, are going to Vegas. Most likely, we'll see what happens. Yeah. And one of the things is they're leaving a bigger market for Vegas. And one of the things is like Formula One chose Vegas. They didn't choose Oakland. Right. The Madison Square Garden Group built the Sphere in Vegas. They didn't choose Oakland or the Bay Area. And they chose U2, who has played in Oakland in over 10 years. U2's played the Bay Area, but they don't play Oakland.
Right.
And so all of these things are not choosing Oakland. They're choosing Vegas. And sure, Vegas is a smaller market, but what do you make of that in terms of when you run a city and you lose these major brands? And the other city is a cultural center. People don't think about Vegas being a cultural center, but there's Picasso's there, there's world-class performers there, not just Donnie and Marie. I mean, there's amazing things going on.
And it is paradoxically both the most, I like to say Vegas is the most American city, but it's also an extraordinarily global city. I mean, you've got probably every bit of the melting pot dynamic in Las Vegas that you'd have in New York and whatnot too. Now that may not be important to the A's, but I'll tell you what's important to the A's. What's important to the A's is revenue per guest, right?
Yeah.
And there's just no way that they can't get more revenue per guest in Las Vegas, because people will be, first of all, rather than just going a few blocks away to the ballpark, it's a destination trip. Somebody who's already into a Vegas weekend for $1,000 on hotel and restaurants and everything, they're not going to think twice about spending a couple $100 at the ballpark on amenities and things like that. It's just, you hate to be this brutal to Oakland, but they just upgraded their fan base and their customer base with the move. Right. Assuming it goes through. There are people mad as hell about that subsidy.
Sure,
yeah.
But
your
also the business
about,
partners are MGM, and they have business partners like crazy that they can. The Greenspun Group is going to sell A's tickets.
Yeah, it's wild. The deal that they cut. You mentioned unions and whatnot. The union carve outs on the A's deal are extraordinary, and it's not just unions. It's DEI requirements. Their workforce commitments to hiring women and minorities are locked in as part of the deal, and they are extraordinarily aggressive. So the unions really went out of their way to make this deal work for their base as well. Mm-hmm. And that gets us back to Oakland, right? Your original question was what does Oakland do?
Yeah,
when it's losing all this, right? Well. Yeah. Oakland needs to figure out and this I apologize because this sounds like consultant bullshit advice, okay? But Oakland needs to figure out what it's good at and lean into that, because the things that it's losing are not things that it ever owned, right? Oh, we had the Raiders. Oh, we had the A's. What you had were destination entertainment retreats and somewhat large scale employers. Does it, why they left matters, but what matters more is what is going to make Oakland attractive to the businesses today and the residents today that are going to be worth billions of dollars tomorrow. Because if you look at the cities the last 40 years that have just grown really robust economic bases, most of it wasn't, we paid a 20-year tax tiff to lure this business from out of town. That when in the last survey I saw, 80% of the CEOs who moved their business because when they moved their headquarters, they said that they would have made the same move without subsidies. Now, none of them turned down the subsidies because that's not the business they're in, right? But subsidies are seen as the only way you can get business into your city. And it's not true. Right. The cities that are experiencing the most robust business climates are the ones that didn't lure a Walmart to town. What they did is they created an environment that allowed the next Sam Walton to get his start and build something in town. And eventually, if a business gets big enough, it attracts an ecosystem of other businesses around it. I mean, that's Seattle, that's Silicon Valley, that's Bentonville, Arkansas. That's the list goes on and on.
Yeah.
The problem we have is that if I go to a city council member and I say that, they will say that won't get them reelected. They have to deliver a big shiny, because big shiny gets you in the paper, it gets you in front of voters. And so that's why these economic development deals, including the deal that led the A's down to Vegas, right, get glommed onto so aggressively by local politicians. It is what looks like to them that they're doing something.
Yeah.
But it's not really the hard work of doing something.
That property is enormous, and it has it's just massive parking lot. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's got an arena and a coliseum and other space, and it's got a direct line for BART, which is this usually insolvent public transit form. But anyhow,
BART hasn't come back well from the pandemic.
No, it doesn't. And I love when they're like, "No, it's totally safe, you guys," and it's the lady who never takes BART to work telling you that.
Yeah.
And one of the things they wanted to put Coliseum City there. They were going to put a convention center, and they were really trying to put something state of the art there. And the city, the residents of the city, they're like, "Here's the thing. We're going to have it. We're going to show you guys what this thing's out." And I think 36 or so people showed up, and they're all like, "Yeah, whatever." They couldn't be bothered, right? And this was their team's new home. Teams, I'm saying plural. And all three teams were going to play there. And the Warriors are like, "This ain't happening. We're leaving." So they already jumped out. And so they had a consultant who had access to money, but the teams weren't going to commit until there was money, and the money couldn't be committed because there were no teams. And the city, they didn't know how to get. This is Pete's breakdown of it. The city didn't know how to drive. They couldn't build a consensus to say, "Everybody get in the room. We're going to make this thing happen." And so instead of having this state-of-the-art thing, what they have is a 50-year-old parking lot with no tenants,
right?
And two aging centers that nobody wants to rent out, because San Jose has built state-of-the-art stuff. Santa Clara County has state-of-the-art stuff. San Francisco has state-of-the-art stuff, and they've just got a bunch of nothing in a town that is, honestly, it's feral.
Well, and even if they'd kept the teams, the really typical dynamic in these deals is that there are all the walkaway provisions in the world on the private side. So the teams could have stayed there. They could have signed a development agreement. They could have captured tens of millions of dollars, hundreds maybe of millions of dollars in tax subsidies, and could still turn around and say, "We're not going to build that thing we said we were going to build because the market conditions have changed." I have looked at a lot of economic development agreements like this, and I can't recall seeing more than one that had specific clawback provisions if the private sector partner didn't meet their commitments. As a matter of fact, we're working on a short documentary right now of a large employer in Kansas City, Missouri, that got what we believe is the largest incentive package ever produced by a local government for economic
Yeah.
development. They met none of their commitments, not for headcount, not for economic input into the community, not for ripple effects. And
Yeah.
then Oracle bought them, and Oracle is busy piecing them out bit by bit. And in the end, the city will have gotten nothing, and they'll be back to having an eyesore property. And it's nothing that 4 or 5 lines in a contract saying, okay, if you don't do X, we're going to claw back this much of the benefit. If you don't do Y, we claw back this much. Simple stuff. And they didn't do it. And nobody does it.
I want to look at the other end of this. Actually, there's 2 things I want to look at the other end of. One is I get creating an environment that allows the new Sam Walton to build his business. What happens when you create an environment where a business is like San Francisco priced itself out of the startup market. It's like, hey, guess what? We're going to do this Silicon fill in the blank, and just go somewhere else. And also, Elon Musk is like, hey, I'm leaving. I just, I don't need to be here. And then the other side of this is, I'm going to be a little hard on Vegas right now. You want to find a place with corrupt courtrooms? You know what? You can go to Vegas. But, however, they won't let the law get in their way, and they'll get a deal done. And so, is that what it takes to get things done? I mean,
I don't think that's what it takes. I think that, your example of Vegas is a good one. Chicago in the 90s and early 2000s is another good one. There was corruption there, and there's in Chicago, depending on how you want to define corruption, there's still immense amounts of it. It's essentially a baronial system, right, where the aldermen can decide what does and doesn't happen in their districts. But it worked for people, right? So if there's corruption, but the streets are clean and the trash is getting picked up and the parks are good, people are going to tolerate a certain level of that.
Yeah.
To your question, does corruption need to exist to get things done? I don't think so. We went and looked at a bunch of different best places to start a business or have a business in the U.S. list. Yeah. Some were produced by academic researchers. Some were pop culture from Inc. magazine and whatnot. And what we found was, you know what? If you're in a Sunbelt city in a state with no state income tax, guess what? Your business is going to thrive there, and you're going to probably be ranked as a great place to do business, even if the process of getting the business started and getting through the paperwork process is a nightmare, right? There are larger dynamics at work sometimes. Institute for Justice did a great study where they looked at a bunch of pretty common use cases. What's it cost how many steps to get a food truck legal? How do you start a barber shop in town? And they compared it across a bunch of different cities, and that was useful research. But while that kind of stuff is useful and it impacts more like small local people, the person who's out there thinking of starting the next Walmart is not necessarily thinking at that scale, right? And so I want every city to be great and easy to do business in, but the fact is that if you're thinking of businesses that are going to scale into the billions of dollars, you're just dealing with the city enough to get started. And then you're much more worried about state dynamics.
So you're less worried about like the DEI and the environmental studies and the, all of these things. And you're more.
I'm worried about it in the sense that, I'm a very simple man. Let people do what they want to do as long as it's legal, right? But it comes back to, I don't think that thwarts an economy the way people, no local government's DEI requirement is impacting by double digits a city's growth, right? Now, what can impact their growth is, okay, nobody wants to build a business here because they can't hire people here because nobody at the lower end of the wage spectrum can afford to live here. That's a problem. And that's why housing one of my lines whenever I give a talk is housing is adjacent to whatever other issue you care about, whether you're
Yeah.
a Main Street Chamber of Commerce Republican or a wild-eyed progressive. Probably whatever else you want to get done has housing to do with it. The condition of your
Yeah.
infrastructure has a lot to do with it. But
Yeah.
I think that a lot of times, because we're sort of process driven on the right and we like the idea of tearing down regulations, it's possible to lean into that almost too much and say, okay, this year we successfully got 5 cities with a total population of 115,000 to make it slightly easier to start a business. And it's not nothing, but
That's
it's
not
not
nothing.
the ball game, right?
Right.
The dynamics for the ball game are much bigger. And I think, as I alluded to earlier, I think they come with some level of, without telling cities too much what they can and can't do, there probably needs to be just enough state preemption to say, no, your priorities are X, Y, and Z. You exist at the pleasure of the state, and the state is saying, pay attention to these things. I think that would be useful. And, more people getting involved, right? I went to a public meeting last night in my own town, and, I'm the youngest guy in the room, and everybody else in the room wants the town dipped in amber.
Yes. Yeah.
And so that's a challenge.
Yeah. Do you got time for another question real quick?
Sure.
Okay. So what are the things that I'm curious about? So extending the conversation from the Oakland thing. Now that we'll just assume that this Vegas thing's happening, that will unlock in this next bit. But Major League Baseball's already walked up to Kansas City and said, hey, look at your adorable, perfectly fine, everybody loves stadium that doesn't have the auxiliary revenue that it needs to have to keep a team in Kansas City. What are your plans to put a downtown ballpark in? So you'll see, and look, Major League Baseball is a strong brand. It's a worldwide brand almost now. And so it's getting bigger. They want to expand. Salt Lake City's always got a packet ready to go. Dave Stewart is making a very strong case for Nashville. Nashville's making a strong case for Nashville. And so Major League Baseball is looking at Kansas going, hey, we're going to need you guys to up your game. What are you going to do? And they get to do that, right? And so when you look in terms of at a planning perspective, if you believe that the common thing that we hear is it's bad business for a city to invest in a new ballpark. And now you're talking about ballpark with all of the auxiliary things attached to it to make it be a profit center for the team so that the team can be competitive within the family of teams, right? That's what they want Kansas, because Kansas can't compete with the Dodgers. Put 4 million people through their turnstiles in a year, right? Kansas can't compete with that and have a giant DMA to sell ads to on TV. Right?
Yeah.
So Kansas has to make more money to be relevant. And all the owners want that. They don't want to have to pay Kansas to be in the league. They want Kansas to stand on their own. So I understand what they're doing. But what does Kansas City? What do the Kansas Cities, plural? What do they do? Do they do anything? And then I want to add an element with this. People forget that when Major League Baseball says, "Hey, we're going to need you to change your ballpark to include Fenway," and Vermont's like, we'll build a new Fenway. All of a sudden, Boston's going to find the money and the space to build a new Fenway because they'll be damned if it's going to go to Vermont, right? And I'm not saying that Vermont's going to do this, but it doesn't take much to motivate a very passionate base to do this. So, in general, what are your thoughts on the leverage that can be applied on having to upgrade what's there? And is it worth it to Kansas?
Okay, so you happen to stumble upon an example where I know the city and its dynamics with economic development deals pretty well. Kansas City, Missouri has never met an economic development giveaway it didn't like. The downtown area where a stadium would most likely be located adjacent to was completely rebuilt 18, 20 years ago, all with tax subsidies, and it did not perform. It has not been able to cover its debt to the level that bondholders thought it would. That largest economic development, local economic
development. Is that Kansas City Live thing?
That was,
whatever it
whatever
is,
they
their
call it.
little gaslight district thing.
Yeah,
right?
their
I
little
live right by
gaslight
that thing.
district, that largest economic development project we're working on that failed, that we're working on a documentary about, that's Kansas City, Missouri.
Mhm.
You can drive around downtown Kansas City and block by block pick out large skyscrapers that were built with tax subsidies that did not result in any net new income. You
Wow.
moved jobs from one part of the region into another part of the region. And
Yeah.
the people who were really good at it did it multiple times. Applebee's jumped over the state line between Missouri and Kansas
I love it.
several times before a Chinese company bought them and they moved their headquarters out to California. So anyway, Kansas City, they are not going to be afraid of subsidizing a stadium. Whether
Yeah.
they should or not is a pretty simple math equation.
Right.
None of these deals pencil out well for the city. You cannot find one that has lived up to all of its commitments and produced the type of revenue that the projections said they would. They go through due diligence processes with consultants who know that their job is to come up with numbers that justify the project, because that's the political imperative, and then the project is justified and doesn't live up to it. I said earlier that I'm a simple guy. I am a pretty simple guy. Pay for your own damn stadium.
Yeah. Okay. All right. There it is. Okay. Are those old, brutal, speaking of brutal, federal buildings that were hulks and stuffed with asbestos and abandoned? Are those still there and waiting to become something? Because they were basically.
That's a good question. I don't know. I know that the Fed built a whole new complex
Right.
that's gorgeous, right?
Right. But
I
the old
do.
post office was.
Yeah, I do not know the answer to that. I do know that the USDA has a big
Mhm.
office in Kansas City, and when they decided to start shopping for office space, did they in fact get a subsidy from Kansas City? The federal government got a subsidy to bring their workers into Kansas City. That's how baked in it is to the system.
Yeah. And so let's play with the Fenway idea. If Major League Baseball is like, hey, Boston, you're going to have to upgrade your stadium. You're not performing well for whatever reason, right? Or the owners are just like, we want a new place. We've spent $200 million in this place. It's not state of the art. It's 100 years old. We want a new yard. And Boston goes, meh, and Foxborough's like, we'll do it. We don't care if it makes money. We'll take the business.
Sure.
Boston's going to go, hold on, right? And we just found $2 billion. You're saying that these deals never make sense, or do you have to get creative? Or
I think you have to define what makes sense. Do they make sense for taxpayers? No.
Right. Okay.
Full stop. Yeah. Do they make sense for a Boston politician who wants to remain a Boston politician? Absolutely.
Okay. There it is. Yeah. It's all so fascinating. And going all the way back to Tahiti, when you look at all of the things that it takes to keep Tahiti afloat, when it needs help, you need a big brother. You need France to help you out when a hurricane or whatever it is, when a disaster hits you. But when you want to be left the fuck alone, you want someone who will leave you alone. You want to have rich people come in so you can have money, but you don't want to have so many rich people you don't have an island anymore, and you get crowded out. So it is hard to be. You don't want to have so much government that you have too much government, right? And you're always trying to balance these things out. And so I don't know. I mean, is there a particular book that you recommend that has good rules of thumb, or are we going to go read a bunch of Faber and just get back to the basics?
Okay, so there are two books, and one of them I'm going to surreptitiously double check while we're talking to make sure I've got the title right here.
Yeah, you do that.
But one is there's a book called Strong Towns, put out by an organization called Strong Towns, and they focus a lot on the fact that we don't build in the same forms that we used to build in, and those were very tested and relatively dense ways. Like, it used to be the most common Main Street design in America was ground floor commercial with residential above, right? And nowadays, in most markets, it's illegal to build that. You'd have to get some special variant to do that, right?
Right.
Instead, we build giant single-story structures that have immense parking requirements. And what we've actually done is we've pushed down the tax revenue from the land by doing that, and it's affected city budgets all over the country. So they have a great book called Strong Towns.
Yeah, I put that link up right there, everybody. Okay.
And the other one, I'm going to get.
I'm going to vamp while you do that. Hey, everybody.
Yeah, vamp for a second. I'm sorry that I'm brain fading and can't remember the title.
You're fine. You find that thing. Well, Greg finds the book that he wants to recommend. This is the Break It Down show. We talk about a lot of things. We talked about Haiti earlier this week. We talked about Israel and Hamas's conflict on Sunday. And we'll be talking about all kinds of things. We got an author coming up on Friday. Make sure you click the subscribe button. That's the best thing to do. And if you want to support the show, you can do that too. All right, what do you got for me?
Okay, what I've got is what I've got is nothing because I cannot find it. So I'm going to stick with my Strong Towns recommendation.
Strong Towns. One book for me, please. Strong Towns. Okay, good. You didn't recommend any Weber because we all got that already. We don't want to have to worry about that. And anything else you want to get into? Any questions you want to ask me before we wrap it up?
You know, I'd like to make a plea to your audience, if I can treat this like a telethon for a minute.
Please.
I don't care if you're a don't change my city NIMBY. I don't care if you want to see everything collectivized and turned into, you know, your town's version of a socialist utopia. I really do care that you get involved, right? To have city council meetings where tens of millions, hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars are being shuffled around, and there's 5 people in the audience and 4 of them are staff and 1 of them's a lobbyist. That's how we get the cities and the neighborhoods we don't want, because we just passively allow it to happen. So, you know, my encouragement to everyone is get yourself to a city council meeting. Make friends with your city council member. Make friends with your mayor. They're not going to be aloof unless you live in Chicago or New York City. They will be happy to take a 5-minute conversation with you.
There's a good chance too that they've got a committee that they love to put someone on. All of a sudden, you're making decisions. You know, people worry about president. Oh my God, you can directly impact budgets by just saying, "Hey, I'd like to get involved. Is there some committee I can sit on?"
Exactly.
And boy, and sometimes I swear to God, this is true. They will carve out an at-large seat. If there isn't one there, they'll be like, at-large, yeah, we'll make you a seat. What do you want to do? Where do you want to work? You know, and boom, you know, you want to make a difference. Just ask. They will put you to work. So that's great.
Yeah,
that's a great.
You know, and be the person in the room who brings your priorities to the room, right? Because nobody else is going to do that for you.
Yeah. And watch out for those bikers, hyper militant. Those guys are.
Oh, man. You know, that's the second hour of this show, right? Us talking about the bike lane militants.
Oh my God, they're like, hey, why don't we all meet together? Why don't we meet together? And I said, no, we don't want to meet with you guys. You take over the meeting every time. And they're like, what do you mean we take over the meeting? And I'm like, you're doing it right now. It's hilarious. It's perfect.
Oh, it's awesome.
Yeah, they wanted our meeting and their meeting. All right, I'm going to run the credits on this thing. I'll be right back to you.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you